What if the Bible you thought you knew was never the Bible at all? What if the most sacred words, the names that once carried the weight of eternity, were quietly rewritten, turned from whispers of intimacy into commands of obedience? In the year 1775, a version of Scripture appeared that revealed a God very different from the one sitting in pulpits today. Not a distant Lord, cold and unreachable, but Elohim plural, multifaceted, a council of divinities. Not a throne above the clouds, but Yahweh, a presence spoken like breath itself. A name meant to bind you to something personal, terrifying, dangerously close. But those names were erased, placed with one word: Lord, a title of authority, a symbol of hierarchy, a crown that turned divinity into empire. Think about it, Tiff. The very name of God can be stripped of its complexity, simplified until only power remains. What else might have been taken from you? The words you repeat in prayer, the verses you hear echoing from the altar, they truth? Or are they ritual commands, carefully engineered to make you obedient? Behind the walls of cathedrals, behind the ink of translators, choices were made not for your soul's freedom, but for control. And the 1775 Bible, buried under centuries of silence, is the forbidden mirror that reflects what was lost. If the divine was once within you, hidden in names now forbidden, what does that make you? And what does it say about the system that needed those names to disappear? Step into the late 18th century, and you find a world trembling on the edge of transformation. Empires rise and fracture, revolutions whisper in crowded taverns, kings and clergy cling desperately to their authority. It is here, in 1775, that a Bible emerges, one that does not conform neatly to the version we know today. At first glance, it looks familiar. Parchment ink, the sacred chapters of Genesis, Exodus, Psalms. But look closer, and something unsettling begins to reveal itself. Names, the very names of God. Written in ways that cut against the grain of centuries of dogma. Elohim, Yahweh. Words that refuse to be contained. Words that carry echoes of a forgotten multiplicity, a forbidden intimacy. To understand the magnitude of this shift, you must see the Bible not as a book of comfort, but as an architecture of power. Every verse, every translation, decision, every name preserved or erased was a brick in a structure designed to hold empires together. Religion was never just spiritual, it was political. It was the invisible scaffolding propping up monarchies, justifying wars, and binding populations in obedience. A God named Lord is a God of kings, a God who rules from above, who demands hierarchy. A God named Elohim, plural and mysterious, is something else entirely. It breaks the architecture. It suggests divine councils, multiple voices, a chorus of powers in conversation. It mirrors the chaos of democracy, of multiplicity, of dangerous freedom. The 1775 Bible sat at the crossroads of these forces. The Enlightenment was awakening minds to question authority, to doubt the infallibility of monarchs and priests. Yet the Church knew well that the greatest threat was not muskets or pamphlets, it was language. If people were told that divinity was already within them, that the sacred name of God was not a crown, but a whisper inside their chest, then no pulpit, no throne, no ritual of obedience could contain them. The architecture would crumble, so decisions were made. Elohim became Lord. Yahweh became Lord. Lord distant, singular, authoritarian. One name to rule, one name to centralize. A linguistic empire forged in ink. But architecture always reveals its builders. Think of a cathedral. Towering arches, stained glass filtering divine light into carefully controlled colors. The very stones are sermons, silent but commanding. So too with Scripture. The 1775 Bible revealed an earlier blueprint, a structure less rigid, more human. In its design, you could still glimpse the scaffolding of older worlds, the polytheistic echoes of QAnon. The covenantal intimacy of ancient Hebrew worship, the shadow of Babylon, where gods debated their fates. It was a structure porous enough for breath, for questions, for dialogue with the divine. But in the centuries that followed, that openness was bricked over. Why? Because architecture serves power. A ruler does not build a palace to shelter the people. He builds to remind them of his dominion. The church did the same with language. By erasing the multiplicity of Elohim and the intimacy of Yahweh, it presented a fortress God remote, inaccessible, and therefore in need of interpreters. And who were the interpreters? The priests, the bishops, the councils, the very same architects who mortared over the cracks. It is tempting to believe the Bible was handed down whole, untouchable, sanctified beyond human meddling. But history tells another story. Councils convened not to pray, but to vote. Translators bent their quills not to preserve, but to decide. Power demanded a straight line from heaven to throne, from God to Lord, from believer to church. Yet the 1775 Bible betrays the fragility of this design. It is like finding beneath a Gothic cathedral the ruins of a pagan temple, half buried but still breathing. A reminder that what stands today was built upon layers of suppression, and so the architecture of evil reveals itself. Not as demons clawing in the shadows, but as men in robes and crowns, making subtle choices with devastating consequences. Choices about names, choices that turned the sacred act of calling upon God into a ritual of obedience, binding entire civilizations into structures of control. What is more terrifying, that such changes were made in secret or that most believers never noticed? That even now, centuries later, people bow their heads to a name that was engineered, not revealed. This is the architecture of evil, not chaos, but design, not accident, but blueprint. And the 1775 Bible is one of the few surviving cracks in the wall, a glimpse into what the structure once was, before the masons sealed it in stone. The question is, if you can see the design, will you still kneel inside it? Or will you step outside the fortress, into the forbidden ruins, where the true names still whisper? Every culture has understood that symbols are more than marks on parchment. They're living keys, containers of power, tools that do not merely describe reality, but shape it. To speak a name is to summon its essence. To erase a name is to silence an entire world. Elohim, the plural name, the word that ripples like a chorus. In Hebrew, its very letters carry vibration, resonances that suggest not one, but many. To speak Elohim is to acknowledge complexity. This is not a neat singularity. It is a storm of voices, an acknowledgement that the divine is polyphonic. Yahweh, on the other hand, is the breath name, a tetragrammaton so intimate it was considered dangerous to pronounce aloud. YHWH was not a title, not a crown. It was breath itself, the exhalation that makes you human. Whisper it, and you bind yourself to the divine in secret without mediator. But the translators strip these names away, their place. Lord, a word heavy with hierarchy, a word that bends the spine in submission. Unlike the living sigil of Elohim, or the whispered breath of Yahweh, Lord is a crown carved in iron. It does not invite intimacy. It demands obedience. This transformation is not accidental, it is ritual. To call upon Lord week after week in prayers and hymns and sermons is to inscribe obedience into the collective psyche. It is a sigil disguised as a title. Symbols are technologies. Corporations know this when they design logos that haunt your memory, colors and shapes that bypass thought and carve themselves directly into desire. Nations know this when they fly banners, when they place eagles or lions on their flags, when they make you stand for an anthem you do not understand. It was not just translation, it was branding, rebranding of the divine itself, a spiritual monopoly secured through one word. Think of the ritual act of reading scripture aloud. Each utterance is a sigil activated. When the word is Elohim, you speak multiplicity, an openness that resists centralization. When it is Yahweh, you breathe intimacy, a God who dwells within your lungs. But when it is Lord, you repeat hierarchy, locking yourself in the symbolic architecture of crown and throne. The power of symbol lies not in belief alone, but in repetition. Every prayer, every hymn, every whispered Lord becomes a brick in the cathedral of obedience. And yet, beneath the surface, the old symbols still pulse. Elohim, the forbidden plurality, hints at divine structures older than Christianity, older than Judaism, resonant with Mesopotamian pantheons and Babylonian councils. Yahweh, the whispered tetragrammaton, carries echoes of breath rituals. These are not abstract concepts, they're living sigils, waiting to be reawakened. The 1775 Bible is like a palimpsest, where these forbidden names still glimmer faintly beneath the ink of suppression. What is a symbol, after all, but a contract disguised as language? To say Elohim is to risk remembering that the divine is not monolithic, but multiple, fractured, dangerous. To whisper Yahweh is to bypass the system entirely, to step into an intimacy the church cannot mediate. Symbols are not neutral. They bind, they command, they enchant. And the architecture of power depends on which symbols are permitted to circulate, and which are burned, buried, or mistranslated into oblivion. We live surrounded by these ritual symbols even now. Look at a dollar bill, a coin, a national sea leech, stamped with sigils that most ignore, but all obey. Look at the logos glowing on your devices, brands you worship without altar or hymn. These are modern scriptures, modern lords, telling you where power lies. The Bible's transformation was simply the same process, older and more insidious. Names were not only altered, they were weaponized. So ask yourself, if one word, Lord, can reconfigure centuries of worship, what else has been reshaped? How many other sigils have been hidden from you? How many names, how many truths lie buried beneath translations? The 1775 Bible forces us to confront this reality. Language is never innocent. It is spellcraft, ancient, and ongoing. Every time you speak, you participate in a ritual older than memory. Perhaps that is the most forbidden knowledge of all. That you were never merely a reader of symbols. You were always their vessel. And once you recognize the sigil for what it is, you can no longer pray without wondering. Who truly hears the word Lord? The God above? Are the architects who taught you to say it? From the beginning of human memory, blood has been the oldest currency. Before coins were struck, before kings pressed their faces into metal, there was always blood spilled on the earth in offering. It's a sacrifice, a transaction written not in ink, but in crimson. And if we look closely, the 1775 Bible is not only about erased names, it is about drained veins. For when the sacred names Elohim and Yahweh were severed and replaced with Lord, it was not just language that changed. A lifeblood was siphoned away from the people, redirected into the veins of an institution. Consider the ancient altars. Lambs bound, throats cut, the smell of iron and ash rising to the heavens. Each drop was believed to carry meaning, to seal a pact between mortal and divine. Blood was never mere biology, it was spirit in liquid form. To control it was to control destiny. In the same way, the sacred names in Scripture functioned as veins carrying divine intimacy to the believer. Whispering Yahweh was like bleeding into the void, offering your breath as lifeblood to the infinite. Speaking Elohim was like tapping into a collective pulse, recognizing yourself as one thread in a tapestry of powers. But once these names were erased, the bloodline was severed. Lord stood in their place like a transfusion gone wrong, cold, distant, synthetic. Blood, whether literal or metaphorical, is always about ownership. To spill it is to declare allegiance. To write with it is to bind. Throughout history, scribes have mixed their inks with blood. Kings have signed decrees with symbolic crimson, and secret societies have sealed oaths with a drop from the vein. Yes. The church understood this well. By altering the names of God, they redirected spiritual blood away from the people and into the chalice of hierarchy. Your devotion no longer nourished your own awakening. It fed the endless appetite of the institution. Think about the ritual of communion, the chalice lifted, the crimson wine proclaimed as blood. It is the most public reminder that power feeds on sacrifice. But what if the greater bloodletting was not in the cup, but in the text itself? Each time you whisper, Lord, you bleed a little of your sovereignty. Each repetition is an offering poured invisibly into the architecture of control. This is not metaphor alone. Repetition is ritual, ritual is energy, and energy is blood. The 1775 Bible reveals this theft in its very absence. The names that once empowered intimacy with the divine were amputated, and with them went the lifeblood of spiritual independence. In their place rose a new circulatory system, obedience flowing upward, fear beating like a mechanical heart, the church as vampire sustained by its flock. Here lies the terrifying alchemy, the transformation of breath into servitude, of name into leash, of blood into coin. We see this alchemy everywhere. Time, 2 is blood. When you kneel for hours reciting titles chosen for you, you bleed minutes into the altar. Desire is blood, bled dry by laws that twist passion into guilt. Even sleep becomes a sacrifice hour stolen by endless ritual obligations. All these currencies, time, desire, obedience flow back to the same vault, the architecture that changed Elohim and Yahweh into Lord. And like any empire, it thrives on sacrifice. Not once, not occasionally, but constantly. The blood must flow every Sunday, every prayer, every whispered title of obedience. Without it, the architecture collapses. That is why the 1775 Bible is so dangerous. It hints at a time before the transfusion, when people could commune directly with the divine pulse, without spilling their essence into the veins of hierarchy. It reminds us that blood is meant to be shared with the infinite, not siphoned by institutions. But there is a deeper terror here. If names themselves are vessels for blood, then the act of erasure is a hidden sacrifice. The names that once bled intimacy and plurality were ritually killed, buried beneath translations. The ink of Lord is not neutral, it is written in the absence of blood, the silence of murdered words. Every page of the modern Bible is haunted by these missing arteries, by the ghost of Yahweh whispered no more, by the chorus of Elohim muted into singularity. So the question presses in the shadows. Whose blood do you spill when you speak? Yours or theirs? Do you feed the vampire of hierarchy, or do you reconnect with the forbidden veins beneath the surface? The 1775 Bible is not just a book, it is a crime scene. It shows us the traces of blood scrubbed away, the lifeblood of a relationship with the divine drained and redirected. And if blood is the oldest currency, then perhaps what was stolen from you was not just a name, but your very inheritance. In the end, control is never about doctrine alone. It is about blood, who spills it, who drinks it, and who commands it. And until we face the reality of what was sacrificed in translation, we will remain subjects bleeding endlessly into a system that was built to drink us dry. Every power structure is sustained not only by force, but by contract. Sometimes these contracts are signed in ink, sometimes in blood, and sometimes in silence so deep that no one even knows they have agreed. The 1775 Bible is not merely a book of words. It is a pact, a covenant between rulers, clergy, and the human soul. To change the names of God is to alter the very terms of that covenant. Elohim, plural and expansive, suggests a divine council in which humanity might find a seat at the table. Yahweh, intimate and breathlike, implies a personal bond, a contract written directly on the flesh of your spirit. But Lord, distant and authoritarian, is a contract of subjugation. It places one party, the church, as mediator and enforcer, and reduces the believer to a perpetual debtor. Think of the great contracts of history. Kings binding vassals through oaths of loyalty. Merchants securing profits through signatures sealed with wax. Governments drafting constitutions that citizens must obey without ever having signed. Behind each, there is always a hidden logic. You owe, you submit, you comply. The Bible, altered in 1775, operates no differently. By erasing certain names and enshrining Lord as supreme, the Church reforged the contract between human and divine. No longer was it mutual intimacy or shared power, it became hierarchy. One signature at the top, endless obligations below. This pact was reinforced through ritual. Each prayer spoken in church is a contract renewed. Each hymn, a clause repeated. Each confession, a signature of guilt inked anew. You did not need to dip your quill into blood. Your voice was the quill, your breath the ink, your obedience the payment. Contracts of this kind are subtle because they hide themselves beneath the language of devotion. Lord becomes not just a title, but a legal seal. Every time you utter it, you affirm the pact. I am below, you are above, and the church stands between us. But what happens when the contract is forged through deceit? In law, a contract based on lies or concealment is invalid. In spirit, the same truth resonates. If the sacred names of God were erased, if the original covenant of intimacy and multiplicity was deliberately hidden, then the pact of Lord is built on fraud. Yet still it binds, because most do not realize they are under its terms. The architects of power know this. A hidden contract is the strongest chain. Look further, and you will see how this theology of contracts spills into the world beyond the church. The rise of debt as a system of control mirrors the ecclesiastical pact. To live in modern society is to sign contracts every day. Bank loans, employment agreements, social contracts enforced by law and custom. Each one says the same thing: your freedom is collateral, your energy is pledged. The shift from Yahweh to Lord was the spiritual prototype of this very system. It taught humanity to accept hierarchy as normal, to surrender sovereignty in exchange for security, to believe that all relationships with power must be mediated by a binding agreement. Even the myths of pacts with demons echo this structure. Think of Faust, signing away his soul in exchange for knowledge. Think of countless folk tales where mortals bargain with infernal powers, sealing contracts in blood. These stories endure because they reflect a hidden truth. Every contract is an exchange of life force. The church did not need to summon demons, it assumed their role. By altering the names of God, it forged a pact where humanity unknowingly surrendered its inheritance of divine intimacy in exchange for the illusion of safety. And like all contracts, there are consequences. To agree to Lord is to agree to be ruled. To erase Elohim is to erase plurality, to silence the possibility of divine diversity. To forget Yahweh is to forget intimacy, to lose the whisper that God might be as close as your breath. These are not minor details. They are clauses rewritten in a contract that now spans centuries, binding billions of souls. The 1775 Bible stands as evidence of the forgery. It shows us the old terms, the names that once opened pathways beyond hierarchy. It is the draft version of a contract before the lawyers of empire revised it. In its pages, you glimpse the truth that the original covenant was never meant to enslave. It was meant to empower. That empowerment was too dangerous for those who profited from obedience. So the pact was rewritten. And now, the very act of prayer, the most intimate ritual of faith, is also a legal agreement you never consciously signed. So ask yourself, what if your entire spiritual life has been governed by a contract that was never yours to begin with? What if every Lord whispered in reverence was also a surrender of rights you didn't know you possessed? And what if the true names Elohim, Yahweh, were not erased by accident, but struck out deliberately, to keep you from realizing that you already had the power to dissolve the pact? This is the terror of the 1775 Bible. It exposes not just a translation choice, but a transaction. A pact of silence, sealed in ink and obedience, binding humanity to a throne it was never meant to serve. And like all contracts, it raises a question: what happens when one party finally refuses to comply? Every society tells itself a story of good and evil. But what happens when the story is rewritten, not to reflect truth, but to invert it? The 1775 Bible, with its forbidden names still faintly visible, reveals how morality itself was rearranged like a set of mirrors in a darkened cathedral. At its core, the change from Elohim and Yahweh to Lord was not simply a linguistic maneuver. It was the rewriting of the moral code that defined humanity's relationship with the divine. Elohim speaks of multiplicity, of divine beings gathered in council. A reflection of ancient mythologies where gods and spirits embodied different aspects of human nature: desire, strength, wisdom, rebellion. To name Elohim was to admit that divinity is plural, and that fragments of it pulse within you. Yahweh, the breath name, carried intimacy, a closeness that blurred the line between mortal and divine. In such a framework, morality is not obedience, but balance, acknowledging the light and shadow within yourself. Engaging directly with the divine without an institution dictating the terms. But when those names were suppressed and replaced with Lord, morality was inverted. No longer was the divine within you, whispering through breath and plurality. Instead, it was above you, distant, commanding, unreachable, without a mediator. The shift redefined virtue as obedience, vice as independence. Rebellion, once the mark of awakening, became sin. Desire, once a spark of creation, became corruption. Knowledge, once the path to wisdom, became forbidden fruit. This is the inverted moral code. Power structures recast empowerment as danger and submission as holiness. To obey Lord was to be righteous. To seek Elohim was to risk heresy. To whisper Yahweh was to trespass against authority. The church did not need demons to invert morality, accomplish the inversion itself, reshaping the very definitions of sacred and profane. Look at the archetype of Lucifer, the light-bearer, who in ancient stories embodied rebellion and knowledge, cast out for daring to defy. His tale becomes a mirror of humanity's own suppressed spark. Under the inverted code, he is painted as absolute evil. But what is he guilty of, if not refusing obedience to an imposed hierarchy? The same act that in other traditions, Prometheus stealing fire, Enki gifting wisdom, was seen as liberation. The 1775 Bible preserves traces of the old current, intimacy with the divine, plurality of being. Yet these currents were cut off, demonized, inverted into shadows. The architecture of this moral inversion is subtle but devastating. It teaches you to mistrust yourself, to see your questions as sin, your longings as weakness, your thirst for knowledge as dangerous. It redirects every spark of divinity within you into guilt, so that you return again and again to the institution for forgiveness, absolution, salvation. It is a closed circuit, a perfect machine. Suppress, condemn, redeem for a price. And this inversion reaches far beyond theology. It echoes in politics, where obedience to rulers is painted as patriotism, while dissent is criminalized. It echoes in economics, where endless labor for another's profit is glorified as virtue, while rest or refusal is branded as laziness. It echoes in culture, where conformity is celebrated and individuality feared. The inverted moral code of the Bible is the seed of countless other systems that thrive on suppression. But here lies the paradox. Inversion is itself a mirror, and mirrors cannot hold forever. The 1775 Bible is one such crack in the glass. By preserving older names, it shows us the reflection before it was reversed. It reminds us that rebellion was once sacred, that intimacy with the divine was not a crime, that plurality was not chaos but truth. The danger is not in the names themselves, but in what they awaken the realization that morality is not obedience to hierarchy, but alignment with the deeper currents of being. Imagine the terror of an institution that thrives on obedience when faced with a people who recognize that their very breath is divine. Imagine the collapse of control if morality is no longer dictated from pulpits, but discovered in the quiet of one's own spirit. That is why the names were changed. That is why the moral code was inverted. Not because truth demanded it, but because power required it. So when you speak the word, Lord, remember what lies beneath. Remember that obedience dressed as virtue is still chains. Remember that rebellion cast as sin is often the first step toward freedom. And remember that the 1775 Bible still whispers the forbidden names, still points to the code before the inversion. The choice, as always, is yours. To bow to the inverted morality, or to risk everything by calling the names they tried to erase. Ritual is the skeleton of civilization. It hides in plain sight, cloaked in prayer books and processions, in flags and anthems, in the smallest habits that shape your day. We are taught to think of ritual as something exotic, black-robed figures chanting in forgotten languages. Circles of salt and blood dripping on altars. But the truth is far more unsettling. Ritual is everywhere, and it does not need incense or sacrifice to function. It only needs repetition, rhythm, and belief. The transformation of Elohim and Yahweh into Lord was not just a translation choice, it was a ritual act. A spell repeated so often that it rewired the collective mind. Consider the Sunday service. The congregation gathers, mouths open, voices rising as one. They chant hymns, recite creeds, speak prayers written centuries before. Every word is a gesture and a great choreography. The repetition is what matters. Each utterance of Lord is a candle lit, a symbolic offering made, not to the God of intimacy, but to the architecture of hierarchy. Over time, the ritual ceases to feel like ritual, becomes invisible, absorbed into the bones of life. And that is the most dangerous magic of all, when the spell no longer feels like a spell. The 1775 Bible is a reminder that words themselves are rituals. Elohim spoken aloud activates a plurality of divinity, suggesting a chorus rather than a throne. Yahweh, whispered like breath, reconnects you to a God who is as close as your own heartbeat. But Lord, repeated endlessly, builds a different world, one of submission, order, obedience, a world where ritual does not liberate but imprisons. The very act of speaking has been weaponized into a liturgy of control. And yet, this structure is not confined to the church. The same mechanism governs nations and economies. A stand for the anthem, hand on heart ritual. Salute the flag ritual. Swear allegiance, take an oath, repeat the pledge ritual. Corporate slogans, jingles, and logos perform the same function, embedding themselves into memory until obedience becomes automatic. Ritual is not a side effect of society, it is its engine. And when the Bible was rewritten, when its names were standardized and simplified, it became the ultimate ritual text, teaching generations to bow with their voices without realizing they were bowing at all. This is why rituals are so powerful. They bypass the mind. You do not need to believe fully for the ritual to bind you. You only need to repeat. Words carve grooves into consciousness, like water wearing stone. Over time, the meaning fades, but the effect remains. To say Lord is not only to describe God, it is to reinforce a hierarchy. To inscribe yourself into the contract of obedience we explored before, each ritual is both a memory and a performance, a rehearsal of roles in a play you never auditioned for. But rituals can also reveal cracks. The 1775 Bible, with its preserved names, offers a glimpse into rituals that empowered instead of enslaved. To whisper Yahweh was to enact a ritual of intimacy, to feel the divine resonate in your lungs. To name Elohim was to perform plurality, to acknowledge that the sacred could not be reduced to a single ruler. These rituals were too dangerous, too destabilizing for the architecture of control. And so they were buried, overwritten, with a new liturgy of obedience. What the architects of power feared most was not heresy in the abstract, it was ritual heresy. A congregation chanting Elohim instead of Lord would invoke an entirely different reality. A people breathing Yahweh instead of bowing to Lord would erode the foundation of hierarchy. Ritual, after all, does not just describe the world, it creates it. The name on your lips becomes the altar you serve. Change the name, and you change the ritual. Change the ritual, and you change the world. Think of your own life. How many rituals shape you without your consent? You wake, you check the glowing screen, you scroll through symbols, you kneel before the invisible gods of commerce and media. Each action feels trivial, but it is liturgical in scale, repeated by billions, shaping entire civilizations. Ritual is not a relic of the past, it is the pulse of the present. And the Bible, altered in 1775, is proof that those who control ritual control reality. So when you encounter these hidden names Elohim, Yahweh, understand that they are more than words. They are fragments of forbidden rituals, echoes of a time when the divine was not monopolized, when spirituality was not reduced to obedience. To speak them now is to commit ritual heresy, to break the spell, to step outside the endless liturgy of Lord. That is why they were erased. That is why they remain dangerous. Because even after centuries of suppression, the ritual power of a name has not died. And perhaps the true horror and the true hope is this: you are already a ritual. Every breath, every repetition, every act of obedience or defiance is a rite inscribed into the fabric of existence. The question is not whether you will participate in ritual. You cannot escape it. The question is, which ritual will you embody? The ritual of control, or the forbidden rituals that still whisper beneath the ruins of the 1775 Bible? There comes a moment when the curtain shifts, when the spell falters, when you begin to see the gears of the machine turning behind the altar. Awakening is never comfortable, it is violent, disorienting, and irreversible. Once you glimpse the system for what it truly is, you can never return to the innocence of blind obedience. The 1775 Bible is not simply a historical artifact. It is a crack in the edifice, a glimpse into the programming that has shaped the spiritual consciousness of billions. To recognize that the names of God were altered is to awaken to the fact that reality itself has been scripted, and you have been playing a role in a ritual not of your choosing. Awakening begins with suspicion. Why does the Bible I hold not match the whispers of the past? Why do the names Elohim and Yahweh vanish into the singular Lord? What purpose does this serve? Each question is a fissure in the wall. And through these fissures, a deeper truth seeps in. Systems of control always disguise themselves as systems of salvation. The church claimed to offer access to God, but in truth it interposed itself as gatekeeper, claimed to preserve truth, but it curated it, trimming away names, books, and meanings until only obedience remained. Awakening means recognizing that what you thought was holy may have been engineered. The ritual of Lord is not innocent, it's programming. The repetition of hierarchy is code, written into your tongue and passed down like a virus from parent to child, from pulpit to congregation. To call upon Lord is to run the software of obedience. And once you see this, the programming can no longer function seamlessly. The spell stutters. The word on your lips tastes different. The world behind your eyes begins to fracture. But awakening is not only about suspicion, it is about recognition. You begin to notice that the system extends far beyond religion. The same pattern emerges in politics, in economics, in culture. Governments demand allegiance not through reason, but through ritual, flags, anthems, pledges. Corporations command loyalty not through necessity, but through symbols, logos glowing like neon sigils. Slogans chanted like prayers. Schools instill obedience not by truth alone, but by repetition, by rituals of grading, of assembly, of silent compliance. Everywhere you look, you see the same architecture. Ritual is programming. Obedience is virtue. Dissent is sin. The 1775 Bible is a case study of this system in its rawest form. By altering the names of God, the architects of control demonstrated the mechanism openly. They showed that to change a word is to change a world. To change the name of the divine is to reprogram the human soul. Awakening is seeing this not as accident, not as error, but as deliberate design. The realization hits like cold water. You were never just a believer. You were the ritual itself. Your body, your breath, your obedience, all offered as inputs into the machinery of control. And yet, awakening carries its own paradox. Once you see the system, you are no longer bound by it, but you are also no longer safe. To speak the forbidden name Elohim, Yahweh's, to step outside the liturgy. To tear yourself from the current that carries the masses. It is liberating, yes, but also terrifying. For when you leave the system, you leave its comforts, its illusions of certainty, its promises of safety. Awakening is exile, but it is also power. The ancient mystics knew this. That is why they whispered the Tetragrammaton in secret, why they preserved the hidden books in caves, why they encoded forbidden truths and symbols only the initiated could read. They knew that to awaken is to risk everything, but also to reclaim everything. Die. The 1775 Bible is like one of those caves, a Dead Sea Scroll left in plain sight. To read it with eyes open is to awaken to the knowledge that your breath, your voice, your very life is not meant to feed the system, but to commune directly with the divine. The system thrives on invisibility. It wants you to believe that obedience is natural, that hierarchy is divine, that ritual is neutral. Awakening tears away that veil. It shows you that every time you say Lord, you enact a ritual of subjugation. But every time you dare to whisper Elohim or Yahweh, you enact a forbidden ritual of liberation. It is not about belief alone, it is about participation. Which ritual will you embody? Which program will you run? Awakening does not happen all at once. It comes in fragments, moments when the spell breaks. When you hear the echoes of ancient names beneath the sanctioned ones. When you feel the breath of Yahweh stirring in your lungs despite centuries of silence. Each moment pulls you further from the system, until one day you realize you can no longer return. You cannot unsee the programming, cannot unknow the theft. You cannot bow to a name you now know was engineered. This is both the curse and the gift of awakening. The curse is alienation. You will never fully belong to the system again. The gift is sovereignty. You finally realize you never belonged in the first place. You're always more than the ritual, more than the obedience, more than the contract. You were the altar, the sacrifice, and the priest all along. And now, in the light of forbidden names, you see the truth. You were the ritual all along. If even the name of God can be rewritten, then nothing in Scripture is beyond question. What else lies, buried, silenced, erased? The lost books await, whispering from the shadows. Join us in the next chapter as we unveil Enoch, Thomas, and Solomon, the scriptures they never wanted you to read.